Hello, everyone. I recently I played a game in the Queen's Gambit Decline, and I faced sort of a maneuver that I've seen several times, and so I finally did some research to figure out what are some good ways to address it. And so I'm going to skip most of the opening here and come right to after this idea of bishop to e6 before the knight has come to b7, and then following up with this b5 maneuver. And this is something that I see quite a lot, and I kind of wanted to take a look at it and see what it looks like. So this move is the first move that leaves the ChessGoals repertoire. Typically, the line that's covered is this rook to e8 maneuver. In the game I found, continuing on with knight to ge2, knight to b7, and now h3, preparing to castle. We, of course, can't castle immediately because of this nice trick that shows up in some of our lines because of the knight being not on f3, but rather on e2. And so h3 to prepare castling, rook to e8, and now we castle, and black hits us with b5. And this is quite an annoying move because it seems like maybe it's the idea is to try to undermine the control of e4, maybe kick this knight away and try to play knight e4, or maybe just try to move the knight away from the e4 square so that our own e4 move is more difficult to play. Even so, it's a bit of a tricky line, and it's sort of annoying. One thing to note is that if there's not b5, and when this bishop is on e6, say they play rook c8, and say we play like rook to a1, and they just proceed something normal like this, so that the queen is not defending f6. Quite a nice move here. We have f4, and the point is that this bishop is trapped, and the knight needs to move. And the reason why this is a problem is that the queen is no longer defending. So it's nice to keep in mind this idea of f4 whenever this bishop is on e6 and there's no queen defending it. Anyway, back to b5. The move that I thought was interesting is this rook f to c1. Now, of course, instead of that, we can continue on with typical play, which so f3, something like rook to c8, and then just hitting with e4. After d takes, c takes, c5 for black. This is looking a lot like a different line that we follow in the ChessGoals repertoire. We do get to go up a pawn. We grab this guy, they take back, we take a knight. After bishop c5, we're going to just drop our bishop back. We are up a whole pawn, but this is messy. Our king doesn't look so great. There's still lots of pieces on the board. There's problems with the rook and queen being lined up. It almost seems like perhaps we had touched binding development. This is totally playable. But when I was looking around for ideas, I found this rook f to c1, and just trying to point out the fact that when they move this pawn to b5, they really undermined it here. So rook to c8 is what black played here. And I think this is also an instructive maneuver. Bishop to g3, really sort of an interesting idea. The point is that we'd really like to put a knight there, and because we want control of this f5 square, which is going to end up being quite important later on in the game, especially connected to the c6 pawn. So bishop to g3, black doesn't have a lot better than to exchange. For example, you can't play here. I will take. When you take, we can. After I've captured a bunch of times on c7, I do get to go up a pawn or a piece. Excuse me, a couple pawns, 2 pawns. So bishop takes, and then knight takes. And this also is a nice maneuver because after a4, after b4, we're not forced to go to a4. We can maybe drop back here and come out to f4 and have a lot of relevant piece play there. So after knight takes g3, black chose to play knight to b6. It seems like his idea was to be headed back to the d7 square, defend here. Or maybe he wants to hop in here. That's no problem. We just play b3. If instead they chose a6 with the idea of just trying to play solid, we can hit a4. And if they push past, we can drop the knight back to c2, which is nice. Black will play a5, probably solidifying this pawn. But now a5 is also a weakness. We're not going to probably play b3. We might try to cycle the knight around to b3. a5 is going to be a big weakness, as well as c6. So this is our main our idea is that we want to play a4 and attack this b5, which is what we're going to see in the game. So knight to b6, we play b3. Bishop to d7, and now a4 anyway. Now, there are three choices. We can take, we can push, they can defend, but if you're not careful, we're going to lose a pawn here. So a6 was what was played in the game, but we can look at b4, and that's going to be similar to what we just looked at. We drop the knight away after a5. The knight comes out to f4, something like queen e7. Just trying to get the queen off the board, but this is already a problem. We have queen to c5, taking advantage of the fact that this knight is not defended. We'd really like to trade queens, and so we can just hammer this pawn on c6. Queen trades, the rook comes in, goes rook to a8, taking advantage of this a5, this nice rook maneuver. Bishop to f5, already seeing why it was important that we control this f5 so that the bishop can come in, remove the only remaining defender, and then c6 and a5 are both likely to fall soon, which means that d5 and b4 are just as likely to follow. If instead we have takes, well, this is kind of nice. We take back with the knight, trade knights. It's important that we take back with the pawn because c5 would have been a discovery, and black would have got to liquidate this pawn on c6. And we just have a really nice looking minority attack where we have exchanged our b pawn for their b pawn, and this pawn totally backwards. We have similar ideas of bishop to f5 trading off, maybe dropping a knight in, and just continuing to pile up on this pawn. We have safe, comfortable pressure here. So in the game, a6 was played. And here we played a5, which is a move I really quite like, kicking this knight back out of the way. It doesn't have a great square to go to. It would have liked to have maybe come to c6, come out to d6, but that's just not an option. So it goes back knight to 8, and now knight to f5, which is a nice move. We want to keep the bishop if we can. If he takes, we're more than happy to post a bishop f5, but we're also threatening knight to d6, forking the two rooks. So queen to c7 was what was played, and now another nice move, knight to a2. Of course, queen can't capture a5 because of knight d6 with this fork. So rook to e6 was played to try to defend that. And now knight to b4. It's important that we left this b4 square. If we were to instead come back and just advance the pawn, which would be, not a losing move, but we just lose so much play against this a6 square. So the idea of not pushing the pawn forward and not trying to, he's never going to play c5 anyway. So this b4 was just completely unnecessary, and it takes away this wonderful square that's going to give us lots of play. In fact, we jump in there immediately. Queen to b7, defending the a6 pawn. Now queen to c5, just trying to get the knight into d6 now. This is a wonderful hole, threatening another fork. He played rook to c7. Again, black is scrambling. They're cramped and they don't seem to have a lot of space. They have no ideas. They're just desperately trying to passively hold on to the c6 square. Knight to d6, kicking the queen around. And now queen to a7, kind of an only move, trying to hang on to this a6 pawn. But then bishop to f5. And you can try to trade queens, but this really doesn't help. We take, yes, you remove a lot of pressure initially from the b5 square, but after rook to e7, we have knight takes and rook to a7, and this pawn is going to fall soon. Again, we're going to come back to b4, we're going to capture here, and then we're going to win this pawn, and we already have a passed pawn up on the 5th rank here. So trading queens didn't really help. So rook to e7 was the other idea that was played, but of course we just trade queens, the rook comes across, and we just grab the bishop, removing the defender, and come against the c6 square. So takes, rook takes, we're doubled up against the a6, there's not really anything to be done about that. Knight to c7, desperately trying to defend, and it's sort of a nice little jump here. We have knight to c8, and the rook is forced away from a6. You can't go back to 8 because we have this knight check with a fork picking up more material than we already have. So rook to b7, and we grab another pawn. We're happy to trade knights. Takes, comes across, no big deal. We jump out, we kick the rook back, and after here, I like this rook to b8. He captured rooks, came across, and I suppose perhaps his idea was to come to c6, but that doesn't work. You can't come back in order to try to come here. The pawn is just going to advance. And after rook to d7, just b7, and here black resigned. Quite an interesting game, and a really nice way to show that you can play against this c6 pawn without going through this typical minority attack, especially if you've held back your b pawns. This a5 maneuver against b5 is really quite nice. So we look through that again just quickly, going back to right after b5 was played. So b5, this idea rook f to c1, not rook a to c1, because we're planning to play a4 to continue opening up lines and creating pressure and taking space and and really attacking this c6 square. So this idea of bringing the other rook across, and then more importantly, maybe not more importantly, but another key maneuver following up was this bishop to g5, exchanging the bishops off so that we can get our knight to g3 with good control of the f5 square. So combining this control of f5 with pressure on c6, with a4 and pressure on b5, and ultimately getting a weak pawn on a5 or a6. Quite nice, and I hope very instructive, and provide you with another way of looking at playing when white has played this b5, or sorry, black has played b5. Thanks a lot, guys. I wish you the best. Bye-bye.